This is the book that we're talking about, American Prophets by Jack Jenkins, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. Something I think will come up as we discuss is that I feel like you could write a whole book of this just from Jacksonville, just from the fights that we have had, from the work that iCare has done, from the work that the Jacksonville Coalition for Equality did for the Human Rights Ordinance. A huge amount of faith leaders signed on with that from many different religions. You could do it with dealing with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And there's any other number of topics you'll see, and I think you'll see a lot of resonance with issues that, Sherry, you may be thinking about in Orange Park, things that iCare has dealt with, Nancy, and things that we as the Interfaith Center of Northeast Florida try to be involved with as well. So this is what each slide will look like for us. I'm excerpting some of the chapters for you. So we're only going to look at about five or six of the chapters. So that'll leave you a little bit to taste if you want to pick up the book for yourself. The first chapter, though, we're starting kind of right with the first chapter after the introduction, and it's called Faith in Public Life, which also happens to be an organization you may or may not be familiar with. One of our board members, Joey McKinnon, is the Florida director for Faith in Public Life. I learned some interesting things about this organization that I didn't know about its origins as I was reading this chapter. And mainly, I learned that this organization was kind of born out of the Center for American Progress, which is a progressive think tank in Washington, D.C., and was crucial in the passing of the Affordable Care Act, the Health Care Reform Act passed by the Obama-Biden administration. There's a lot of great detail about how they were involved, and a lot of the political maneuvering. So I think that this chapter is a great one to demonstrate the importance of interfaith coalitions directing their efforts at making policy change. So there's a lot of different ways that we put our interfaith power together. And, there's the protests that we've been seeing more recently. One of the ways that I've loved seeing iCare work, and one of the ways that Faith in Public Life worked in this setting, is to get in with our elected officials and leverage our power with them. On the slide for you is a particular instance from Nebraska. So Senator Ben Nelson of Nebraska was one of these on-the-fence guys with the Affordable Care Act. He was a conservative Democrat serving Nebraska, so he was concerned about pro-life issues, abortion issues, and how what things might be funded by the Affordable Care Act, which was a big dispute and has continued to be. And so he wasn't convinced that he would sign on for the Affordable Care Act, but his support was crucial to getting it passed. So this passage comes from pages 23 to 25, and Jenkins, the writer, starts by saying the idea was to leverage the religious voice in these states to make it easier for the lawmakers to embrace reform. So now this next quote is from another player, Faith in Action. One of their folks, Whitman, said, faith can play a role in creating common ground, just practically providing politicians with cover for supporting things they know they are right, but are afraid they're going to pay a penalty for. This is the strategy. And that reminded me of iCare rallies. So those of you who aren't familiar with iCare's work, when you go to the big assembly that iCare has each year, the Nehemiah Assembly, you have a couple thousand people packed into a congregation, into a church or other congregation, and there are elected officials on stage having their feet put to the fire, being asked questions of policy, of dollars in the budget. Will you commit resources to this restorative justice program for our public schools so that we don't put kids into the criminal justice pipeline? State's attorney, will you be transparent with police camera footage and with numbers on arrests? And so there's this incredible people pressure, which on the one hand, elected officials don't want to say yes, and sometimes they don't. But there's also this power because they can look up at all the people and see like, oh, this many people have my back if I say yes to this thing that I might not be sure about, this policy that I might feel exposed on. Here's 1,500, 2,000 people who have my back. And so I thought of that in seeing this strategy that was used with Senator Ben Nelson. And in particular, as you go down in this passage, you can see that Faith in Public Life, what they did was to help coordinate a sign-on letter with 24 Nebraska faith leaders, some who identified as pro-life, some as pro-choice, urging Nelson to support it. And they said, we are Nebraskan religious leaders guided by the core of our faith traditions that teaches the principles of justice, human dignity, and the common good. And this was literally the day before the vote. So it was like right when his feet were to the fire. And the next day, Nelson did announce that he would support the ACA. Now, as with all things, there were multiple factors involved. And so there might have been other reasons that he decided to do this as well. And like all good politicians, he got some stuff for Nebraska out of his deal. But, you know, these faith leaders made sure that they put the pressure on for this, you know, this thing that mattered to them, getting healthcare to as many as people as possible. And sure enough, when there was a campaign of commercials later that year praising Senator Nelson for his action, one of those faith leaders that was on that letter was featured in that commercial, praising him and supporting him and backing him up after he supported the ACA. So you can see this pressure, but also this, you know, giving cover and telling politicians, look, we're in support of this, so you can trust us to let people know that you stood up for what was right. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and see if there were any things that resonated with you about this example or any connections that you made to the work that you do or are interested in.
I would just say from an eye care perspective, you did a great job of painting the picture of what our big assembly is like. And as the person who's been involved with the restorative practices, restorative justice from the beginning, we have had tremendous success with getting the officials to change their behavior. And consequently, last month, there were only 5 youth arrested in Duval County.
Hmm. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Are some of those programs still in place?
Yes. The neighborhood accountability boards that we got started, unfortunately, are not meeting, but the staff from the counselors from teen court are handling those cases via the phone at this point in time. And we'll get back in business as soon as it's determined that it's healthy for us to do so.
Yeah. Yeah. And Nancy, one of the things that the people that go to the assembly don't necessarily see, but I know that happens. And I think this is the same with all kinds of political advocacy, is that you're not effective if you only see the people at that meeting. Y'all are meeting with the officials throughout the year.
Yes, we are.
Right. So you're building that relationship and rapport and giving the officials the opportunity to be prepared to say yes.
Well, they know exactly what we're going to ask them before they get there.
Yeah. So it does seem, I've heard some people say, oh, it seems so confrontational. And I'm like, well, they know what's coming. Yeah. You know, they go knowing that this is going to be asked, and whether they may not know ahead of time whether they're going to say yes or no. They probably do. But yeah. And then sometimes officials don't come. I remember the year that Mayor Curry didn't come, and that had an impact on my view of him for sure.
For a lot of us.
For a lot of us, yeah. So this is this chapter is really focused on this public advocacy and how we can affect change. This is on a national level, but this kind of work happens on the state level. Our board member, Joey McKinnon, works with the Florida state legislature. They have been working on basically a human rights ordinance for protection for LGBTQ people statewide. So they've been working on that for a number of years, and they get more and more support every year. They don't have enough yet to pass it, but by that persistence and that relationship, they have built support to provide those protections. And they have these faith advocacy days. So I went, and I know I went with other ministers, and we were specifically doing faith advocacy, saying, hey, I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, I'm supposed to love my neighbor, whoever my neighbor is. And that means my neighbor should be safe. My neighbor should have the same rights that I do. And so we make that kind of faith advocacy to our legislators. So I think it's something like iCare does, we can equally apply at a local level. Sherry, is your group thinking at all, are you all thinking in terms of like affecting local policy and politicians, or are you more of just like a gathering, to build those bridges of difference right now?
Well, I think that the reason for the group that meets out of St. Augustine, which is composed of a number of pastors and a number of lay people in a number of different churches, the thought is to help develop leaders to understand and become change agents. So where we are going from there, because this is all kind of new to us, and we're just going to start a book review in person on our church grounds outside in September with a few other people. But again, it's just a starting point. And so one of the reasons I'm sitting in on as many things as I can is to get ideas, to think through where we might go.
I love that you all are at that stage. It's wonderful to hear a group that's starting the work. What church are you out of?
My cohort and I are Orange Park United Methodist.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, I live up in kind of the heart of Jacksonville, around downtown area, and San Marco Church is a United Methodist church here that's doing a lot of great stuff with racial justice right now. So I know the Methodists have a lot of good things going in that pipeline. All right, well, let's keep moving. I'm going to take us on to our second slide, and that was kind of the perfect transition in terms of talking about race. One of the chapters that's really impactful in this book is about the Black Lives Matter movement, about the Ferguson uprising. And so I thought I'd bring out a little bit of that. This chapter is called The Keepers of the Story. And it's very much about Black Lives Matter. So this excerpt is from pages 99 through 102, and it all feels too fresh this week with what's been going on, with what happened with Jacob Blake in Wisconsin, and what we've been seeing all summer. And so this was on August 9th, 2014, that local police officer Darren Wilson shot and killed Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old Black man who had graduated from high school just 8 days before. This was in Ferguson, Missouri. Within a day, there were reports of looting at Ferguson establishments, and elsewhere protesters were flooding the streets. The light-speed escalation surprised many, including Reverend Tracy Blackman, who is over in the picture there with the loudspeaker. Her Christ the King church, where she served at that time, sits about 3 miles from where Michael Brown was killed. So what happened was these protests were happening, and she put out a message to clergy about whether anything was going to happen, and people were kind of tentative. So she decided to do something and said, hey, I'm going to do something. And people are like, okay, we'll come. And so they went out and had their own kind of thing. But they showed up at this police station. And then all of these protesters showed up there as well. And this was a crowd of perhaps 500 demonstrators. So there's like some clergy and there's 500 demonstrators, primarily young people of color, stretched across the pavement in front of her, while Black men and clergy deliberated about how or even if to respond. These local activists had protested for hours. So while she and the clergy were kind of figuring it out on Facebook, the kids were out on the street. As more clergy arrived, Black men hastily informed the demonstrators of her plans, and the protesters agreed to participate with them. But their patience ran thin. That's enough praying, they said. What are we going to do? A group peeled off from the vigil and began sitting in a nearby road. Black men and other clergy tried to stop them, voicing concern that the police would retaliate. Realizing they were settling in for the long haul, Black men finally left the clergy and asked the demonstrators who were sitting in the street if she could pray with them. They agreed, suddenly making Black men a participant in their protest, not the other way around. The movement was orchestrated by a coalition of activists, often led by tech-savvy young people and assisted, but not necessarily led, by clergy. So I thought this story was so important for us right now after what we've seen this summer. The protests in the streets in Jacksonville were led by primarily by young activists, especially the Jacksonville Community Action Committee. And they are a bunch of 20 and 30-somethings, mostly 20-somethings, that organized some incredibly well-done protests. And, you know, today, some of you may or may not know, today was the anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday, the 60th anniversary, which was this instance of violence against young Black protesters in the former Hemming Park. A mob of white men with axe handles came out and beat them after they had been staging a sit-in at a lunch counter. So, and it was these young men, these teenagers, who today, as you know, 60-something-year-old men, 70-something-year-old men, were talking about their experience that day. And it was just it's so incredible to think about them at that age, and now these young people in the streets in Jacksonville and Minneapolis leading the way. And this story of Reverend Tracy Blackman was so interesting to me because she recognized their power. And she didn't, you know, she had her own thing she was trying to do, but then she recognized the power of her just actually following them, that there was some truth that these young activists had, and that she needed to be with them rather than feel like she had to do her own thing. So there was some humility in that because, you know, she's clergy, she's older than them, but she humbled herself. So I'm really interested in the implications for us right now. How can we humbly follow the lead of social justice advocates? It's in Black Lives Matter, but it's also in the environmental movement. You know, the Sunrise Movement is this incredible movement of young people right now that are demanding that we address climate change because it's their world and their kids' world that's warming and that's becoming more dangerous. So I wonder if this resonates with anyone. Do you feel like you have seen the power of young people to make change recently, or just in your experience through life, have you seen this power of young people to make change?
You know, thinking on the climate change, certainly young people have taken it upon them, taken it out of our generation, their parents' generation's hands to really stand up and say something about it. And the same with Black Lives Matter. I think probably one of the biggest issues is, does it transpire to anything else? They are still reliant because of their age and because of the age of people with the political power, who look after who run these organizations, are still this older generation with these far more conservative attitudes that are far more interested in capitalism and making money. And and I think they're doing a really good job of trying to change that. But I think it's a very slow progress, and I don't think that older generation is as interested and willing to see the change and the necessity as much as the younger generation does.
I think that's true through history. I'm part of the older generation these days, and I can tell you that throughout my life, that's been my experience, that it's often much harder to get the older people to engage in creating change than it is younger people. But we can't give up. We have to keep trying. And young people have a lot of power if they can be guided to use it in a positive way. And when they do that, you really do see massive changes take place.
I think an interesting comment that I've heard and read also was from a Black African-American person saying how important it was that non-people of color observe what is wanted and what is being done by people of color, rather than assuming that what is the right thing to do. And that was what was happening, although she is a person of color, with Reverend Blackman, that she realized that maybe her thought or plan was not what was needed right at that point. So I think we have to be careful not to, if we're not a person of color, not to impose what we think is right.
Yeah, Sherry, that's such a great and important point. I mean, it's that white saviorism instinct that is kind of baked in to being a white person in America. Even when we may feel like we're liberal or progressive, or as the kids say these days, woke. Even then, it's so easy to fall into that that white saviorism.
When Dr. King was assassinated, I was in DC working at a community center in Southeast DC. And one of my assignments was the 4th grade boys club. And I can remember when we got together after this, he's saying to me, one of the little boys, "I hate all white people." And I looked at him, I said, "Well, I don't really think you hate all white people, because I don't think you hate me. Maybe you haven't noticed, but I'm white." And for me, that was a very powerful moment to hear him say he hates all white people. And then our being able to have a dialogue about that in that group. Because I could totally understand where he's coming from, but I thought it was important that I have the opportunity to point out to him that he really didn't hate all white people, because I knew he liked me and didn't hate me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Alex, I'm wondering if you've seen any of this in relation to Turkey and things that have gone on in the country in the last couple of years, all the tumult. Are there youth movements? Are there people who are trying to lead change like that?
I mean, there are similar to every other country, but I think that their ability to really express what they feel is governed by the existing legislation. Existing laws in Turkey are so restrictive. And unfortunately, most of the Middle Eastern countries, they prefer a strongman administration. And if you look at it, there is a correlation between the underdevelopment and authoritarian regimes. Out of the 49 Middle Eastern or Asian countries, 48 of them are with authoritarian regimes. And one thing that we have to be mindful is that now all the, I don't want to call dictators, but all strongmen or authoritarian regimes, they come with the election. I mean, it's not like they are appointed. They are not like, really they come through the election. And the reason for that is, of course, they seek for legitimacy. And, but I think the existing laws, like I can speak for Turkey for one, if any political party nationwide cannot collect 10% or better votes, they, you know, no matter what happens in one particular district or the election region, they still cannot be represented in the parliament. So all these restrictive legislations and laws, it's just making it very difficult. And of course, state of emergency declarations are like done every other year. And then here goes all the democratic rights, and then now it comes in, you know, because we really want to protect this unknown state, because we apply a lot of sacred values to the name of state. You know, the state is like so sacred. So I'm sure on an individual basis, or even some groups in Turkey are very much in tune with anything else is going around the world, especially in the Western world. But unfortunately, the expression of it, and then, you know, we take it for granted, the constitutional right we have to demonstrate peacefully, it's not even exercised in some other countries. So I'm always mindful of that. Yeah.
And that, you know, it's a completely different discussion when we talk about how, you know, what kind of politics can happen, what's the possible in those political systems. So
but change comes in different, and you know, they are mostly led by young people, but I think sometimes change comes in different forms, even in the most if you remember the so-called Arab Spring and all these things. And, you know, we will see what happens in Turkey, but things are very grim, you know, it's not.
Yeah, well, I'm keeping everybody there in my prayers, so.
We appreciate that.
Yeah. All right, well, I wanted to leave one more insight with Black Lives Matter before we go. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently is, you know, I'm a Christian, and I've been thinking about how white supremacy has been kind of interwoven with Christianity through American history. And that's something I have to come to terms with as Christian. You know, it justified, you know, the genocide of indigenous people and taking of their land. It justified, you know, that was the doctrine of discovery. And then, of course, you know, the Bible being used to justify slavery and Jim Crow, and you know, we're still living with that. And so it's a complicated thing to see how Black Lives Matter intersects, but it's not just from my side. So a couple of years ago, I was doing an event at UNF, a Black Lives Matter dialogue between a gay Episcopal priest and my thesis advisor from the University of Florida, who was who's a Sufi Muslim, both of them Black, two completely different generations. My thesis advisor was a civil rights veteran. This young man was even a couple years younger than me, so early 30s. And they had this dialogue on Black Lives Matter, but when I reached out to the Black Student Union at UNF for their involvement, the president deferred me to his vice president because he said, I don't believe that Christianity can be a religion for Black people because it's the slaveholders' religion. And that's the first time I'd ever heard that perspective. I knew it was something, I knew that was something that had, you know, been said. I knew that was something that people had thought, but I'd never actually heard someone who believed that. This young man, 23, 24 years old, he was very generous. He, you know, he passed this on to his VP so we could work with with her, and we had a great turnout from BSU, but yeah, he just didn't want to be associated with it because he just didn't see any use. Now I had a Muslim speaker as well, but he was looking at that Christian perspective and saying that's the slaveholders' religion. On the other hand, I got a slap on the wrist from my bosses at the Episcopal Diocese for doing that event because I did not ask for permission for it ahead of time on purpose. And because I got a call, the canon, so the second in command in the Episcopal Diocese is this guy, he's a wonderful guy, Allison DeFore. Actually, his wife, Randy DeFore, is a city council member now. Allison is he was the sheriff of Key West. He was the lieutenant governor candidate with Bob Martinez, I think, in like 1984 or 88 or something. And he's this gentle Episcopalian priest, but also kind of a law enforcement guy. And so he was a little upset with me about not balancing things out at that event. But the reason I didn't ask for permission is because I didn't want to, quote unquote, balance it out. I wanted to have just two Black people being able to talk about Black Lives Matter without some white person having to tell them, oh, you have to balance this out. So that was a really interesting intersection where I kind of saw two different angles on viewing Black Lives Matter and religion and how it interacts. All right, let's keep moving on. This next chapter of the book I wanted to share with you is about creation care. So we talked a little bit about climate change. Actually, these next two slides are about this chapter because it's so rich. So Jack Jenkins, the author of this book, he confesses that when you talk about what's considered the religious left or progressive religion, you in America can easily talk a lot about Christians and not a lot about other religions. And if there's a critique I would give of his book, it's that he acknowledges that, but then I wish he had tried harder not to just do that. But this is one chapter where you get a really fascinating perspective on creation care that's primarily seen through indigenous eyes, with a little bit of Pope Francis thrown in. So we'll get to Pope Francis in the next slide. But most of the chapter, he talks about activists in Hawaii, at the Mauna Kea volcano, and at the Dakota Access Pipeline protests that kind of seized the news several years ago in 2016, I think. So this is what he has to say about creation care. This is kind of how he starts the chapter. I once asked Native Hawaiian activist Joshua Lanakila Managul to explain the connection between his religious beliefs and his environmental advocacy. He said, "There is no separation from our spirituality and our environment. They are one and the same," he told me in 2016. Other religious groups have these debates about whether or not God exists, but I know my God exists. It's the mountain. I can see it. I could still hear his words repeating in my head 3 years later as I stared up at the big island mountain, Mangul, called God, the towering peak of Mauna Kea, there to cover the growing protest movement against the construction of the 30-meter telescope at the Alps summit. Through a series of dramatic protests rooted in claims that certain lands and waterways are sacred and worthy of protection, indigenous protectors in Hawaii, North Dakota, and beyond have caught the eye of popes, politicians, and progressive masses. The sheer magnetism of their spiritual activism has lit a fire underneath at least 3 burgeoning global movements at once: faith-rooted support for environmentalism, the push for indigenous rights, and the campaign for climate justice. So were any of you familiar with the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in 2016? Did you follow that in the news?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That was for me, I have to say, like, that was one of the moments that really caught my attention with indigenous. I think it's one of the things that transformed my understanding of indigenous advocacy, of advocating for indigenous people and how they advocate for themselves. I think that, like a lot of white kids growing up in America, it's easy to like learn about, oh, the Native Americans, and there's this tragic past, and then, yeah, there's the reservations out there somewhere, and it's all very like distant. So I was grateful for this opportunity to be awakened and to improve my perspective. And Jack Jenkins gave me way more context than I had known before. And this, I had heard a little bit about the telescope in Hawaii, but I hadn't read much about it. So I learned a lot more about the indigenous Hawaiian expression. But I wondered if any of you, if you resonate with this, do you think, you know, in your religious context, whatever it is, or if you're not religious, in your view of the world, do you resonate with this idea that spirituality and the environment can be one and the same? Does that resonate for anyone?
I would have to say absolutely. My view of faith is definitely entwined in nature, whether you want to configure it as Mother Nature or our environment, and how it is all so closely interlinked, and us with it, and all the creatures and the different environments and the biodiversity on this planet. So yes, that definitely resonates with me.
Mm.
Same with me. In my faith, in the scripture, actually, there are more than a dozen references to the signs of God. I mean, here is the Native American is saying that, indigenous person saying that, look, I know there's God because I can see this right in front of me. Very similar to that in our faith, God Almighty in the scripture says that, look around you, all my signs around you. So really this is a manifestation of course, we know everything we see is created by God Almighty. And if we cannot see him, we can just look around, and then all his signs, all his footprint is around us. So in that case, there's no question about it. And there's also one verse in the Quran. It says that if the end of the world, I'm sorry, this is a hadith by the saying of the Prophet. I thought it was a verse, but it is a hadith. And it says that if you notice that that day was the last day of the world, and there's the calamities coming, there's the judgment day, the life as we know it is ending, and you are holding a small vegetation, just plant it. So just again, it's really saying that there is a big connection between the Creator and the environment that we see around us.
Mm. Yeah, it's certainly something that I've read a lot about in Christianity. I really resonate with Celtic Christianity, which goes back to kind of even the pre-Roman days in the British Isles, you know, when the early, you know, before the Roman Church kind of came in with a more doctrinaire and more kind of separated church and environment kind of perspective. The early Celtic Christians very much incorporated their kind of previous pagan view of the earth as sacred. They even, you know, there was even this kind of conception of like earth, and I think, Alex, this goes to what you're talking about of the signs of God in nature. Earth was like their like scripture before they had, you know, the Christian scriptures. It was what told them of God's greatness. And I find a lot of spiritual connection when I'm in nature. So I definitely resonate with that. Nancy, Sherry, any of that in your practice of faith?
Absolutely. I think when I look at the nature around me, I feel like I see God in that. It's here because God has created it and given us the responsibility of taking care of it. And I think it's part of what, for me, gives me some refreshment when I need it. When I'm becoming depressed and things, I can look outside and see the beauty of nature, and it sort of is healing for me in that way.
I think so many times a lot of the youth church programs, summer camps or things are held outside. And I think there's a real connection being made for the youth with nature. And I remember back to a lot of things myself that really were impressive because they were conducted in God's world, so to speak.
That's a really interesting connection, Sherry, and I definitely resonate with that from my experience growing up going to camp. We were always in beautiful places, like in the mountains. It's like and this is, from the Celtic tradition too. They have these holy islands like Iona off the coast of Scotland that a lot of people do pilgrimage to, and they call it a thin place. And I think the mountains are like that for me too. It's, a place where heaven and earth are so close. It's like there's only a thin paper between them. And I heard Nancy say the word responsibility. So I think, for a lot of us, there's this sense that nature, there's this good feeling of nature, but it's also the sense of like moral responsibility. It's not just that we can use nature to feel good, but that we should take care of it as well. Jenkins goes a little bit into some interesting intersections with Christianity. So you get a little of Pope Francis in here. But I wanted to start by way of, the sadder history that Christianity has with nature and with indigenous people. So, at Dakota Access Pipeline, it's this story of, there's this lake on the reservation that's close to this pipeline, oil pipeline, and the worry is that the water is going to get polluted, and this is their water and their land, which are both sacred. So it's not just a matter of we need drinking water, although that's part of it, but it's a sacred responsibility to protect the water and the land. And the pipeline threat reminded this particular speaker that Jack Jenkins was interviewing here, this activist at the Dakota Access Pipeline. It reminded him of when European colonizers decimated Native American populations, invoking Christian theological ideas such as manifest destiny and its older cousin, the doctrine of discovery, which had been a papal decree by the Pope, basically that, whatever they discovered, they could take. Both beliefs anointed European colonialism and the American westward expansion with a spiritual justification for enacting systemic violence against indigenous peoples. So this is one of those stains on our past as Christians. And that's part of what made it so amazing that from the beginning of Pope Francis's, from the beginning of being Pope, he emphasized the importance of protecting the earth. Now, this is something that Pope Benedict prior to him and Pope John Paul II had spoken about as well. So Catholics have had a pretty good record, probably a better record than Protestants on environmentalism for a while. But Pope Francis made sure to say in his inaugural Mass, "Let us be protectors of creation, protectors of God's plan inscribed in nature, protectors of one another and of the environment." His earth-focused theology struck a chord with Catholics and non-Catholics, but there was this rift within Christianity, and it sliced between the scientific community and white Christians. And white Christians, both Protestant and evangelical, were the groups least likely to say they were very or somewhat concerned about climate change. And this is according to research by the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI.org. They do a lot of great research around religion and society. So, there's this sad reality, but then another positive thing in October 2016, when this chief Arvo Looking Horse of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota nations called on faith leaders of all traditions to assemble at the Dakota Access Pipeline Camp, a group of more than 500 interfaith clergy, including Episcopalians, Methodists, Lutherans, and Presbyterians, came to stand with the indigenous people there. And so, both with Pope Francis and with, mainline Protestants, which I know some of us belong to, there's this hope that we are, returning to honoring creation and returning to honoring the indigenous people of this land that our, ancestors colonized. So that gave me some hope, seeing those changes. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep on pushing us so we can have a little more discussion on a different topic. So another really fascinating chapter for Jenkins is this chapter, Prophets Over Prophets. And this is about about religion and the economy. And he focuses very much on the Occupy movement. So Occupy Wall Street, Occupy and the other places that that movement went, including Occupy Boston. And it brings up a long history, actually, of progressive religion commenting on the economy and what a just economy would look like. So most media outlets focused on the Occupy movement's secular components, but there was a wave of Occupy protests that was in progressive faith circles. So in New York City, a group of more than 50 clergy led a procession. Participants declared Wall Street has become an idol. And in Occupy Boston, they had a prayer tent that played host to Muslim prayers, yoga workshops, and a Yom Kippur service, of course, in our Jewish neighbors' tradition, that drew more than 125 attendees in those tents at Occupy Boston. So it was this interfaith thing. So looking back into the history, I thought these two quotes were really provocative, and I'd love your thoughts on these two quotes. The first is from a proponent of what was called the social gospel, which included people who identified in the early 20th century as Christian socialists. They were preaching spiritual critiques of capitalism. Some of them I didn't identify specifically as socialists, but they were still offering those critiques of capitalism. One of the main voices was Walter Rauschenbusch. So if you read about American social justice history in Christianity, you read about Walter Rauschenbusch. And he was a white Baptist minister. And he authored in 1917 this book, A Theology of the Social Gospel. And in it, he wrote, if we can trust the Bible, God is against capitalism. Now, imagine how that would go over in conversation in our current political climate. He wrote, if we can trust the Bible, God is against capitalism in its methods, spirits, and results. And then Martin Luther King Jr., more and more throughout his career, spoke out in kind of more leftist ways about the economy. And in his speech to the staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1966, he said, there must be a better distribution of wealth. The earth is the Lord's. And since we didn't make these things by ourselves, we must share them with each other. So, wondering your thoughts about Rauschenbusch and Martin Luther King. Do you see a connection to the issues in our communities or the issues that matter to you as a progressive person of faith?
Certainly I do.
Yeah, Nancy, this is to some degree, I mean, I care wouldn't necessarily, I care definitely wouldn't identify with any political party.
Right.
But the idea of the distribution of our collective wealth as a city is very much what I care is all about. It's about what our priorities are and where we put our money.
Right.
What are some of the issues that have been at kind of the top of the list for iCare in the last couple of years?
One of them was bringing a viable grocery store to the northwest part of Jacksonville, where they have a hard time having a place that they can go and buy the kind of foods and things they should be able to at prices that they can afford. So there's been a lot of effort and work put in that area. And there's also been work put into the whole concept of trying to equalize things across the city and not having just these small groups of very wealthy people that are controlling everything that's going on throughout the city, but having the voices of the masses heard in terms of what their needs are and what they need to have in order to be able to lead healthy, successful lives.
Yeah. To me, that's from a Christian perspective, that's very much the social gospel. It's the, Jesus preaching that I've come to, preach good news for the poor, release to the captive, sight to the blind. It's a material difference that Jesus makes, not just an invisible spiritual difference.
Right.
What are some of the thoughts that the very wealthy who call themselves, whether they're evangelical Christians or more central Christians, how do they reconcile passages in the Bible versus their place or their location and their influence and their wealth in our society and the inequality? I struggle a lot with, okay, so you say you're a Christian, but everything I see you do and hear what you say does not sound Christian to me. What does some of the research, how do people justify their position and their religion when their actions don't meet their words or their idea of faith?
Yeah, well, part of it's just the interpretation of the Bible. My teacher, Reverend Tim Simpson, used to say, we all have our canon within the canon, which is to say the canon is like the Bible, but we all have our things that we pick out, and this is how we interpret our faith. And everybody picks and chooses. There's not a single one of us that doesn't do that, whether we're liberal, progressive, evangelical, Presbyterian, Unitarian, we all do it. So the verses that some of these folks pick are different usually. So for instance, there's a verse where Jesus says, the poor will always be with you. And that is used in more conservative economic circles among Christians to say, hey, this is just always going to be reality. We shouldn't be trying to eradicate poverty because Jesus said the poor will always be with you. There will also be verses that are brought out that emphasize charity along with personal responsibility. And so the argument goes, I have a lot of money and I choose to use that to help people. And each person is responsible for whether they're successful or not. It's kind of like it's the Western Christian idea of the holiness of wealth, of working for your wealth. And the idea is that if people don't work for their wealth, or if they don't have to work for the things that they get, then they won't appreciate it. They'll take advantage of it. That's kind of the critique of programs like welfare and other social safety nets. So those Christians have their verses, but they tend to emphasize the stuff that's more about we can't change the world and everyone is personally responsible, but they don't emphasize the social responsibility as much, or at least not the government's social responsibility. It's nonprofits or private individuals or organizations' responsibility, not the government's responsibility.
Yep.
And Jack Jenkins goes into that. So that chapter is great in showing kind of both sides of, you get this kind of like more progressive economic statement of faith, and then you get this conservative economic statement of faith as well.
Interesting.
Alex, can you say a little bit about, or Aidan as well, about, what does the prophet say? What does the Quran say about, a just economy? What's going on there?
Well, I mean, in the very beginning, those years where the Islamic faith really produced philosophers and the rich class, the idea was the clergy and the religious class were independent of the state and the rulers. So in order to be independent of the state and the rulers so they can criticize them, the religious class mostly were merchants. Even the prophet was a merchant, as you know. So, but in the Islam is one of those 5 pillars is really to give the, in one verse it says that you are cleansing your wealth by giving what's due to the needy. So that's one thing that it guides me at least, but this is exactly, it's very clear. There is, of course, we do the same as Christians, we do pick and choose hadith and the verses, depending on, especially after 12th century when the religious class became an alliance with the ruling class. And of course, they manufactured a lot of jurists, they manufactured a lot of jurisprudence saying that, this is okay, this is acceptable. For example, right now, our dear president in Turkey, there was a lot of criticism of him having a palace 16 times larger than White House and 1,120 rooms and huge complex. And when somebody criticized him and all his religious crew came to his defense, and the defense was, hey, listen, this is the reputation of the state. You cannot be frugal with the reputation of the state. So, this is really representing the whole Turkish people. Therefore, we cannot be frugal. We cannot be stingy. So it's, you can pick and choose just like
yeah.
it.
Alex, that sounds so familiar to what you hear from mega church preachers.
Yes, exactly.
Like,
they had a wealth doctrine, if you remember. They said, the more money I have as a priest, the more wealth I have, that's good. And that was a religious, yeah, I remember.
Yeah, it's absolutely considered a reflection of holiness.
Yes.
Despite indictments.
Yeah.
So thank you, Alex. So we are about at the end of our time, and I don't want to take us over, but I wanted to just share a couple of more things before we go. One is Jenkins has a great chapter that he calls Troubled Waters, and it's very much about interfaith solidarity. A couple examples, he shows that in the height of anti-Muslim sentiment in 2016, Dr. Muhammad al-Sanusi and Reverend Richard Kilmer worked together to bring together an interfaith coalition to combat anti-Muslim hatred. And then within a week of the 2016 election, the American Jewish Committee and the Islamic Society of North America teamed up to form the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, which was aimed to address anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism in the U.S. So these examples of interfaith solidarity are important to hear. I also, the other thing I thought of is that sometimes, you know, because our Muslim friends experience Islamophobia and our Jewish friends experience anti-Semitism, sometimes we focus on those two things so exclusively that, you know, it's almost like we're only defining Muslim and Jewish communities in terms of that issue. And so I just wanted to bring up a couple of local examples of faith-based charity. One is Jewish Family Services, and the other is Muslim American Social Services, which is a free health clinic for those below the poverty line. And these are two examples of faith communities that are doing interfaith services to anybody, no matter their faith, to serve community needs. And I always love to highlight that kind of stuff because I just feel like I don't want my Muslim and Jewish friends to only be defined by the issues of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And I want people to know about what they do in the community. And our Sikh Society also. The Sikh Society in Northeast Florida has been serving meals to the homeless during the pandemic. Their secretary is a member of our board, Sukhbir. So just wanted to highlight that. And then there's another great chapter on LGBTQ justice. I'll just tell you that exists, and that's a great chapter to read. And I'll recommend Jack's book. Definitely a great read for inspiration. Definitely a great book to read with a group and to maybe even do like a longer study with. Like if you wanted to do something with like a church group or a book study group, this is one of those books where you could take 3, 4, or 5 weeks and really dig into the different chapters and never run out of things to talk about. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. We appreciate your presence here with the Interfaith Center in Northeast Florida. We have not set the date for our upcoming events, but Emma, I think that the next thing on our schedule, I think, was going to be our talk of faith and politics for the 2020 election. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, and we were looking at it from a couple of different angles, but certainly how political capital takes control and lacks religious tolerance, and some examples of that around the world.
Yeah, that's right. We were going to make some connections to Turkey and India. And like Alex says, there's a lot of places that are struggling with, these kind of strong-armed governments that seem to be overstepping. And I think there's some lessons we can learn. So that will be in September. And if you all registered for this, that means we have your email. And if you're not already receiving our newsletter, Emma sends those emails out, and you'll see that date set in sometime in the next week or so, probably. And we would always love for you to join us. Emma, anything else before we go?
No, I think that's pretty good. This is our 5th Mutual Curiosity session and our 4th one online. We only managed to do one live one before coronavirus took hold. But thank you very much, everybody, for participating. We appreciate having a small group and everybody getting to put forward their thoughts and have that small conversation. It's great.
Any comments or questions before we go?
I would just like to thank you for bringing this book to my attention. That was a wonderful book to read. It was very informative. So thank you.
Absolutely. And so you made it through it.
Absolutely.
Oh, good. Yeah. I was thrilled to see so much of what I've seen around me. That it's the story that doesn't get told of progressive religion and the difference it can make in the world. So glad you came, Nancy.
My book arrived a couple of days ago. I will read it, and then I would like to discuss a couple of chapters with you. On the next September conversation, of course, it's very high press, the Hagia Sophia issue, that maybe we can just include that into our conversation just because it's media popular now. So we'll talk about that, what's going on with the Hagia Sophia.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, y'all. Well, thanks
Thank
for
you,
being
Matt.
with us tonight, and we hope to see you again before too long.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We
Good night.
appreciate
Thank you, Emma.
it. Thanks. Night.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.